Mr. Angus, welcome here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ferguson. And I want to say at the outset the enormous respect I have for the work that you and your predecessor did on shining a light into the black hole that is Indigenous Affairs and now Indigenous Services. This day is the 8th anniversary of the death of Shannon Coustachian, who was the youth leader who had never seen a real school, living in a country like Canada. And she fought for education. I find it appalling that after every report that your department has come out with, that we're still talking about the, quote, incomprehensible failure. If a department refuses to put the interests of children first, there's nothing incomprehensible about the failure. This is a predictable outcome. What's incomprehensible is how governments and departments year in, year out could have such a disregard for children, the children of Canada. I want to just start right off on page 13 where you talked about the importance of literacy. In 2013-2014, Indigenous Affairs, for the first time that I ever remember, did a report called the Success Program, where they listed the literacy and numeracy rates. And in Ontario region, the literacy rate for boys was 21%. The numeracy rates was 18%, 20% for girls. For the Waterloo Public Board, the literacy rates are 85%, and yet the government or the department at that time announced in the same report that they were discontinuing keeping track because they thought the money could be spent better elsewhere. So I ask you, from what your concerns about literacy, what better thing could a department that looks after children's education spend money on than finding out whether or not children can read?
Mr. Ferguson.
So, again, I think the audit certainly did point out to the fact that there has not been improvement in the education outcomes of First Nations on reserve students. And we've been doing audits in this area for almost 20 years. Again, the thing that I would want to add to what you said is literacy is one of the most important things. It's the literacy outcomes that need to happen. So the money is the enabler, but they need to make sure that the money is spent in a way that's going to get outcomes. And that's why, I referred to the fact that over 4 years the government spent $42 million on a preparatory program to help prepare First Nations on reserve people to go on and take post-secondary education, but only 8% of them completed that preparatory program, let alone how many of those 8% actually went on. So there needs to be, it can't just be about the amount of money spent. There needs to be also, a connection to say, and that money is going in the right places, and it is achieving the outcomes it's supposed to achieve.
Well, one of the fundamental principles of education is you have comparable data. Our public system produces some of the highest quality education in the world, and yet Indigenous Affairs has no comparisons with children in the provincial system, no idea how the management of programs, no attempt to actually identify the education gap that exists. And I find on page 17 you say that they misrepresented the graduation rates, which they claimed were 46%, when the real number was 24%. I would put it to you, from the communities that I've been in, where I see young people dropping out in grade 6 and 5 because they're so hopelessly behind, that these numbers might be even higher. But how can we allow a system to run when they don't even bother to find the comparisons with other students who are in the same provincial mandated curriculum?
Well, and the premise of this whole audit was governments talk often about the need to close that socioeconomic gap that exists between on-reserve First Nations people in particular and other Canadians. And the first thing we identified was they aren't measuring what that socioeconomic gap is, and the information they do have is based on census information. So the most recent, and they haven't updated it for the 2016 census, so the most recent numbers they have on what they call their Community Wellbeing Index comes from 2011. So they need to have a much better way of identifying what is a socioeconomic gap, how do they measure it, how do they know what's happening to it. And when we looked at the specifics of education, as I said earlier, something that we've looked at almost 20 years ago, we saw that there has not been any improvement in the socioeconomic, the education outcomes, the gap in education outcomes between the rest of Canadians and First Nations on-reserve students.
Well, thank you for that. What concerns me is that you identify in your report that back in 2000, Indigenous Affairs committed that they would start to get comparable numbers. I believe in 2004, the Auditor General asked for that, maybe 2011, they followed up. In 2016, the Parliamentary Budget Officer asked where those comparable numbers were, and this department hadn't bothered to get the numbers. To me, this is not a failure. This is systemic negligence. If this was in the provincial system, heads would roll, but with Indigenous Affairs, it's just another day at the office. How can we be looking at a report today where they haven't bothered to gather information they were told to get 18 years ago? For a child who was in grade 8 then, their kids are in the same broken system. I've got kids who are dropping out. We're losing a generation after generation of young people because of this negligence. How do you hold them to account to say, if you are not going to bother to even track the numbers that you're ordered to by the Auditor General, you shouldn't be allowed anywhere near programs for children?
Mr. Chair, you know, the only thing that I can say is in the course of these audits, we identify these issues. The departments will come back and say that they are going to do something. They will always agree with our recommendations, and they say they're going to implement something, but too often when we go back and do another follow-up audit, we find that they haven't done it.
But it's 18 years. 18 years of kids' lives that they didn't bother to track.
So there's no way I can explain that. You know, that's the department that is going to have to explain that. We are, I guess, as you know, as disappointed as anybody when we see, you know, that issues that we raised many years ago aren't followed up on, and not just issues that we raise, but issues that come out of other reports, as I mentioned, in those other types of areas. So there are many different ways that government programs are evaluated and recommendations are made to make improvements, and it's extremely discouraging for us to come back and find out that departments have committed to do something, and then we find out that they haven't done it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. Angus, good questions. We'll now move to Mr. Area.